Hi, my name is Mark Borstein. I am the CTO at Tremolo Security, and today we are going to talk about integrating Azure AD into your Kubernetes clusters using OpenUnison. So why would you use OpenUnison instead of, say, the OU log, or excuse me, the OIDC login plugin, kube login plugin, I think, for kube control that just lets you do OpenID Connect? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, OpenUnison gives you secure support for the dashboard for free, integrates it right there for you. Two, lets you have a zero configuration deployment for your client. So we take care of all the certificates, we take care of everything else for you. And three, and this is really important specifically for Azure AD, when we look at, we'll dive into the details, Azure AD doesn't send group names, it sends group IDs, which can become really difficult to manage in RBAC. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do the deployment. I've got a fresh cluster running. We're going to use impersonation, which means that we're not going to integrate directly with OpenID Connect with the backend. We certainly could do that, but to make the video a little bit shorter, I just go ahead and do impersonation. That said, I'll go ahead and link in the show notes to show notes, not a blog post, or it's not a podcast, but I'll link in the notes to the video instructions on how to integrate OpenUnison using OpenID Connect with an on-prem cluster. So with that, let's get started. All right, so I want to be able to follow everything. So on the left here, I have my, oops, make this a little bit bigger, a little easier to read. So on the left here, I have my deployment instructions. I'm going to have my actual work area, and then finally I'll have my clear. There we go. I'll have my web. We're actually doing our work. So I'm going to come back here, and let's come to Azure Active Directory. So let's start walking through our deployment process. So I've already got Nginx deployed on this cluster. I also have the Kubernetes dashboard already deployed. So we are going to create a new namespace. We're going to make sure our repos for Helm are updated. And the first thing we're going to do here is deploy the operator. So the operator does a lot of the intelligent work. It will set up key stores, trust certificates, can even do some work with SAML if you're using SAML. We're not going to in this instance, so that part doesn't really matter. But the point is that you need the operator first. That's the first thing you need to deploy. And that usually sets up pretty quickly, and it's already up and running. If we take a look just to see what the landscape looks like. So our pod is up and running. Awesome. So next thing we need to do is create our source secret. So you do not in general want to store secret information in either a Helm chart or a custom resource. You always want to store that in a secret. Why? First off, it makes RBAC easier because now you can isolate secrets. Two, if you're using a external secret manager, it makes it easier to provide those secrets in a standard way. So let's say you're using Vault to store secrets. Well, you can have Vault sync those secrets into a secret object. So that way those secrets stay up to date. So it's always just the best practice. Don't store your secret information inside of either Helm chart, Git, or CR. So I'm going to do exactly what the documentation say not to do, in that I'm going to just go ahead and take the default values. So the two secrets here, the first is the Kate's DB secret. This is used as part of the SSO process. The user will never know this. Just make it random nonsense. Same thing with Unison key store password. This is for the PKCS12 file that gets generated by the operator. You do not really need to know this. So again, random garbage, just no ampersands. Only time you ever generally need it is if you really need to debug by downloading the key store. But that key store, the secret source secret that the operator reads from is now up and running. So now we're going to get to the important part. So we're going to get the latest default.values. And I'm going to just download it directly here. I'm actually going to remove the old. And let's re-download that. Okay, cool. So let's open that up. All right, so this is the file we just downloaded. This is our default YAML file. And let's come back. And so the first thing we got to do is decide if we're going to use impersonation or not. The default is false. I'm actually going to set it to true, so that way we can have a little bit of a shorter video. Next is the network section. So we've got to go ahead and go through and figure out what we want to name our system. We're going to need 3 host names, one for the OpenUnison portal. That's where you get your keys. That's where you authenticate to. One for your dashboard, and then one for the API server, your API server proxy. So that's what our kube control is actually going to interact with. So I am incredibly lazy. I don't have a DNS server set up that's going to work. So I use nip.io. That is a great tool for just debugging purposes, and you can see I already have it in here, where if you give any host name with an IP address in it, it gives you back that IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and replace these. And coming back here, if I try to access this host name, it's going to give me back this IP address. So it's great for testing. It's great for debugging. I use it pretty extensively, or we use it pretty extensively in Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide 2nd edition because, you know, it just makes life easier not having to set up DNS manually. And with that done, the last step is we have to choose one of our authentication methods. So we're going to go with OpenID Connect. Let's go ahead and uncomment that all out. And let's go to choose identity source, OpenID Connect. We have AzureAD all ready to go. So this is an example of what the ID token is going to look like coming back from AzureAD. And you'll notice here that roles is this big gnarly string of characters. It's a globally unique identifier. I don't know if it's type 4 UUID. I don't think so. But the point is it's from an identity management purpose standpoint, it is a best practice because that is immutable. That is not based on a name. So you can change the name of the group and the group memberships and everything won't change. That said, it doesn't really work real well in RBAC because in RBAC, it's just comparing strings. And so that can be really difficult to manage if you have a lot of RBAC permissions based on groups in AzureAD and you don't have an easy way to map between them. So what we're actually going to do is provide that mapping inside of OpenUnison. So let's come over here to my groups. Instead of 212.702.A6 blah, 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 which is this, we're going to write our RBAC binding with Kate's administrator. A lot easier to deal with. I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Much easier to deal with than the object ID. So that said, let's go ahead and configure AzureAD. So we'll come back to our default directory. And let's go to app registrations. And let's create a new registration. So we're going to call this OpenUnison AzureAD demo video. And this is going to be just folks inside of our directory. And we need to set our web redirect. So this is going to be your OU host. So if I come up here, you can get that. And then the path is always going to be auth OIDC. So this is how AzureAD knows to verify the redirect back to OpenUnison, because you actually specify where you want things redirected to, because you can have multiple clients on a single identity provider, and what you don't want is to be able to have someone construct a URL that redirects the authentication information to some random host. That'd be bad. All right, so I did that. And next we're going to go ahead and add a certificate or secret. So this is how the connection between OpenUnison and AzureAD is secured, is with this client secret. So we'll call this OpenUnison. Depending on your tolerance for risk, you can change that to whatever you like. I like to go 12 months. Pro tip, set a calendar invite for 11 months so that you know to update it. All right, so we've got that. And now we need to edit our source secret. So kube control edit secret orchestra secret source and OpenUnison. And we need to create client secret. Oops. Can't type. Let's go ahead and grab our client secret. Now we need to base64 encode it. Quick tip, if you are doing this using the echo command, make sure to type in echo-n so you don't get an extra carriage return. I like doing this in Azure or in Visual Studio Code. It's got a great plugin for base64 encoding and decoding. Don't know how I lived life without it. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we can go ahead and add our claims. So we're going to go to token configuration, add optional claims to the ID token, and we want email, family name, given name, preferred username, and finally user principal name. So why do we need all these attributes? It'll make it a little bit easier to debug if there are issues later. We actually create a account object inside of Kubernetes. It's actually a user object for inside of Kubernetes that contains this information. And so if you're debugging or you want to find the right user to revoke privileges from inside of Kubernetes, this makes it a lot easier. And then we want to turn on those graph permissions. And then we're going to add the groups claim. Now, you don't actually have to do this. I'm going to do this to show you what it looks like, but you can actually skip this step, and the step's not in the documentation. So we're going to add to ID, and we're going to admit it as the role claim. Now, there are different options here. The group ID, which is what I showed you over here, back up here, that's this silly string. But you could also, in theory, use your kind of legacy attribute names. They're not guaranteed to be there, though. That's the thing. If the group is being synced from an on-premise AD, it might be there, but it's not an attribute that's guaranteed to be there. So that's where things kind of get a little hairy. Let's go ahead and add that. So that's done. And let's see what we got over here. So the next thing we need to do is enable the API. So OpenUnison, in order to get the actual group names, is going to look up your account after you sign in by going to the AzureAD Graph API. So we need to give OpenUnison that capability. So let's go ahead and add permission. Microsoft Graph at an application level. We're going to do user, and we want user.read.all. I'm going to go to group. We're going to choose group.read.all, and then finally group member read.all. So these permissions are similar to if you were going to look up the user in Active Directory on-prem. So we've done that, and the last step is to grant admin consent. So it is a auth 2 underneath OpenID Connect, which means you're supposed to be consenting to these attributes. However, this is an enterprise setting, so you don't want users to have to individually grant their consent. So you can do so as an administrator. Great. And so that's done. Now we get to configure OpenUnison. So let's go back to the overview. We'll need to get some information. And let's go ahead and configure the OIDC section. So we need the client ID, which in AzureAD parlance is the application ID. we're going to need the issuer. Now, the issuer will always be the same in Azure AD versus others. So we need the tenant ID, which in Azure AD parlance is directory ID. We're going to change this. We're going to say that the user is in the ID token, so we don't have to go and do a secondary lookup. And we're going to remove groups because there is no group scope in Azure AD, so that's going to cause all sorts of havoc. Our sub is going to be UPN. Email given name, display name, and we're going to change this to roles. And then the final step here is what we're going to need once we have, once we want to go ahead and integrate with Azure AD's for lookup, is we're going to need the tenant ID again. All right, so we have our values.yaml. We're going to come back to this part. This is where we do the group lookup. So we're going to start with deploy portal. And so we're back here. So let's go ahead and deploy Orchestra. So Orchestra is kind of the workhorse. That's where all of the deployments set up, ingress objects, services, all that good stuff is set up. OpenUnison dash value default.value YAML. So saved? Yes. Okay. All right, cool. So if we take a look and OpenUnison, we'll see that we've got two pods creating. This first one is our Kubo IDC proxy. So this is what lets us do impersonation. This is what your API or your kube control is going to interact with. And so this will work just fine, whether you're talking about an on-prem cluster or a cloud-hosted cluster, like maybe you're trying to set this up in DigitalOcean or Civo or Amazon or Google, whatever, doesn't matter. This is what lets you interact with your API server. Excuse me. And so this pod is really all the work where the work's going to get done. Now, if we take a look real quick at what this looks like right now, you're going to see a lot of errors, and that's okay. These can all be ignored because we haven't actually deployed or configured OpenUnison. We've just deployed that base layer. So now, let's go ahead and deploy the login portal. So this is where all of our specific configuration is. So this is where we configure our authentication, the different screens, etc. Now that that's all done, let's go ahead and try logging in. Okay, so everything's deployed, and let's. You'll notice that our login portal is now, or excuse me, our API server is now, our API proxy is now up and running. It's got an OpenID Connect trust set up with OpenUnison. Our Orchestra pod is running, and our latest deployment actually included an Nginx pod that hosts all of our static HTML content. So let's come over here and let's log in. And I'm going to log in as Kate's admin. And so I'm logged in. That's my username. And you can see here, here's my role. That is not going to be very fun when it comes to setting up RBAC permissions. So let's go ahead and talk directly to Azure AD to turn this into an actual RBAC permission. So we're going to come back to our Azure AD configuration. And we did all this. this. Okay, here we go. We are going to, so we did this part, right? So we have Azure AD Tenant ID. And so the last thing we need to do is add OpenUnison include auth chain. Include auth chain to Azure AD load groups. So OpenUnison is really flexible. It's giving us the ability here to actually insert additional authentication steps. In this case, we're going to create a custom chain and call that chain that has a mapper in it that will actually reach out to Azure AD, get the user's groups, and add it to the user object. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to upgrade our login portal. And so what that's going to do is that's going to tell OpenUnison, hey, go ahead and include this Azure AD load groups. And then we have to deploy Azure AD load groups. So this is the step that we skipped earlier. So now let's go ahead and log out. Now let's log back in. And we're going to log in as Kate's admin again. And we're logged in. And there we go. We actually now have the role of Kate's administrator. Let's go ahead and check out the dashboard. You'll see we don't have access to anything. It's because we got to set up an RBAC role. So let's go ahead and do that. And here's our cluster role binding. So let's go ahead. And what's our group name? Kate's administrator. Call this Azure AD cluster admins. So this is the great thing about this is now I have a RBAC that has a human readable, so everything is now going to match up. Let's go ahead and create F. So cluster role binding's been created, and let's see here. This should be pretty much instantaneous. There we go. I now have access to everything. So let's go ahead and take a real quick look, show you there's nothing up my sleeves. Export kubeconfig gets temp t kubecontrol get nodes. So we're going to come back here, kubecontrol tokens, and run our kubecontrol command. So what this did was this actually set up our entire Kubernetes configuration for us. If we take a real quick look at temp T, it created our certificate authority data so that we could trust OpenUnison. It set up our cluster URL. It set up all the certificates, said who the user was, set up our OpenID Connect with our ID token and our refresh token. So everything is set up. Now all I have to do is kubecontrol get nodes. Now the first one's a little slow because it's usually running a refresh. I do it a second time, bam, comes right in. Get pods and OpenUnison, kubecontrol exec ti. So I'm all in there. So, and then the great thing is I'm going to go ahead, log out, and watch kubecontrol get namespace. So keep an eye up here on the clock, and what we're going to find is that in a minute or two, when this token is, there we go. So the token expired, and because we logged out, that destroyed our token um, inside the API server. And I'm actually already logged out there, so that's actually not going to work anymore. So now I have to log in again. So we just ran the gambit. We set up Azure AD with OpenUnison. We were able to configure it to be able to use real group names, not just the OIDC group name or the role ID. And we're able to set up an RBAC binding and get both CLI and SSO working. Thanks again for joining me. If you'd like, hit that like and subscribe button. It does make a big difference. And if you have any questions as you're going through this, please feel free to open up an issue on the OpenUnison Kates repo. Thanks and have a great day.